Well, good afternoon and welcome to our latest Clancast. Who are we? So this is a little bit of a deviation from our normal course of Clancasts in that we have had a few questions about what it is that we do, and we thought it might be really helpful to understand what we do. So we're going to spend a few minutes each today just telling you what each of us does. But before we get into that, I wanted to set a bit of the context here. So Dataplan came about as a consequence of a national expert panel that was formed last year to support non-healthcare key service providers in their response to the COVID pandemic. And the five of us that you'll be finding out a bit more about today came together on that panel with several other colleagues. And we were all brought together and selected for that panel in part because we were experts in very different and diverse areas. And what we found over the course of last year was that as we started to listen to the challenges organizations had and try to help them, we found ourselves talking about these challenges with insights from each other that none of us could have possibly seen on our own. And that coming together of these very, very different perspectives, we came to realize towards the end of last year that that was great for the response to COVID, but actually it was great in a much wider sense. And I think we all knew that diversity is a good thing, getting different perspectives is a good thing. But I think certainly for myself, and I'll probably speak for some of my esteemed colleagues here, I think it was the first time I'd really felt that in a very tangible way, week in, week out, having these conversations and hearing how a psychologist might look at something differently, or an architect might, or somebody with a clinical background might look at something that I thought I understood, and yet I'd hear something that I'd never even conceived of as a kind of facet of the subject, never mind understood it. So Dataplan was thus born. And we've been working together now on this really since the start of the year. That's when we launched. And fundamentally, we're about bringing these diverse perspectives to solve essentially complex problems. And I think in this world, we'd all agree that we're facing a lot of complex problems. So hopefully, as some of our clients are already beginning to find, thankfully, there's value in what we do. And that value, hopefully, will be available to anybody listening here. So that said, a bit of background there. We're going to do this, as I say, a few minutes each, just to tell you what it is that we individually do, rather than talking about the kind of projects we're currently engaged in bringing these different disciplines together. So I'm going to kick this off. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, and then we'll go around in no better order than alphabetical, my colleagues here. So I am Dataplan's Chief Executive. I am also our workplace and data expert. So I'm a graduate in mathematics. You can probably tell by the color of my hair. That was some time ago. But nonetheless, mathematics is something that stayed with me, not just since graduating, but also before graduating. In fact, when I was 5, my beloved mother loves to tell the story that when her and my father asked, what would I like for my birthday? My answer was a calculator. And they were so skeptical that they actually ended up taking me to the shop to show me what a calculator was. And I was like, yeah, that's it. That's what I want. And they conceded and bought me a calculator for my birthday. Unsurprisingly, perhaps before my next birthday, I already needed a better calculator. But I think therein lies the, I'm not sure whether that's geekiness or nerdiness that is probably a core part of my being. I went on after graduating to work in software development, and that really appealed to me. I was fascinated by the creative experience. And I think those of you who are familiar with mathematics at a degree level or thereabouts will realize that the maths we do at school tends to be very kind of learning by rote. It's very, you just got to know stuff and do arithmetic and things like that. But mathematicians don't really oftentimes care very much about that side of mathematics. That's considered a bit dull. And maths is in many ways more like art. In fact, my degree is a Master of Arts. It is not a Master of Science or anything else. And I think that fairly reflects the nature of mathematics. And I work with Siemens creating software to produce three-dimensional models of manufactured products, anything from PCs to trains. Siemens have a very broad manufacturing portfolio. And then went on to work with Swiss Bank Corporation developing trading floor systems. So very, very different kinds of things, but all the way through was fascinated by how you could create using software. I also was fascinated by the process of the creation, not just the results itself. And I got involved in methodologies for developing software, particularly capturing business requirements that led to software systems, and did some work with a pioneer at the time of object-oriented methods of software development called Ian Graham. And in fact, contributed to his book, as I remember. I think I might have an acknowledgement in the book. That was my first, and only for very, very many years, bit of my name being published anywhere. And after Swiss Bank Corporation, I had a kind of change in direction. I wanted to really understand how organizations worked. So I'd been working in big organizations with Siemens, 500,000 people, Swiss Bank, 50,000 people, massive organizations that I couldn't possibly begin to understand. And I started looking for a role that would put me in a small organization where I could perhaps at least attempt to understand what it was that made an organization as a whole work. And I moved to a software development company who happened to be providing investment appraisal software for the real estate industry. And that's when I got into real estate. And this is in the late 90s now, so it's a long time ago. I touched lots of areas of real estate over the years, most recently working with corporate real estate teams, looking at occupancy and how you can analyze the occupancy of particularly commercial office buildings. I found that fascinating, both from the perspective of how you measure it, but also the kind of change management and the engagement. People, you know, when you're measuring how what people do in any kind of context, there's sensitivity around that. And so that's really interesting work with unions and lots of experience, I suppose, about how you communicate when you're doing something that's potentially a little bit contentious, like putting a sensor under somebody's desk to tell whether they're there or not. And some of that work was done with William, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later on. And I guess just to kind of wrap up in terms of my background, that kind of all joined together with the whole data piece, because I increasingly became aware that most of the people I was working with had a fairly low understanding of stats, and in fact, a fairly low understanding of data. And that made it very difficult for them to exploit anything that I did. Whether or not what I did was good, that was academic, because it was almost impossible for them to exploit. And so over the last few years, I've been much more focused on supporting organizations in their awareness and understanding of data and how you can take advantage of that. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from. What I'd like to do now is invite Claire to tell us a little bit about her background. So Claire.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, so I am an organisational psychologist. So I am head of leadership and culture at DataClan. It's been amazing to be part of this DataClan journey. I'm just passionate about people, fascinated and curious, always have been. I've been told that I was a why child. So ever since I can remember, I'm always asking why. Why do you do that? Why did they do that? And that's really, that curiosity has carried me through. I did a psychology degree. And then one of my lecturers, who I really loved, was head of a research unit at the university, City University. And she was, we were doing the first ever longitudinal studies in the world of children born through assisted reproduction. So IVF, donor insemination, egg donation. This involved going out to families, talking to the parents, assessing their relationship, looking at the social and emotional development of the children. And we had the chance to go back over time to visit these families. So we built up a relationship with them, which was absolutely fantastic experience. It was an interesting position to be in, because we then were attending medical conferences with all infertility specialists to present our work. And at the beginning, when we first started doing that, there was very little interest from the medical profession about the psychological impact and outcomes for these families. And it changed very gradually over time, which was fantastic. And the other reason I loved it is that we were looking at something that was at the cutting edge of science, but was somewhat behind, or society and law were somewhat behind where science was. So we fought for our presence at these conferences, and we've had some amazing findings, not least that actually the most important thing for children to grow up healthily is that they're loved. Doesn't matter who that's by necessarily. But I got a little bit disillusioned because with academia, because all the results tended to sort of sit in which journal you published in, and there was a lot of academic rivalry, and I thought, well, the people that really need to get to these results are the patients themselves. So I decided to then go out into the real world and moved into organizational psychology. So team coaching, individual profiling. When I started 20 years ago, I started working on a leadership program at London Business School, and quite similar to my experience of trying to get into the medical world, actually, is that people were very suspicious and very defensive about finding out about themselves, about getting feedback. It was like, preparing was like a white knuckle ride to go in to try and facilitate these discussions with people. But over time, that's changed. So we're seeing psychology coming into the workplace, whether that's in terms of development, building self-awareness, and most recently, and what I'm particularly interested in, and my special area of expertise, is collaboration and relationships, workplace relationships. I never lost my pure passion for psychology. So in 2004, I trained as a couples therapist, so I have a private practice. And I think since probably about the last 8 years, I started realizing that actually some of the questions that my business clients were asking me, like, how do we build more trust-based relationships? How do we collaborate? The answers I was giving to them were very similar to some of the things that I would say to my couples in the consulting room. And at the time, when I first started in organizational psychology, people would say to me, Claire, don't tell them you're a therapist. Don't say anything like that because you'll put them off. And in fact, when Chris and I worked together at Zurich, I was doing some work with their team back in 2013. And one guy from America couldn't barely even make eye contact with me. And one of my colleagues said, Claire, he's terrified. So things have changed a lot since then. And I think, there's much more focus on values-based leadership, on building trust-based cultures, so that the global business context has changed, which requires people to pull together quickly in teams to be able to work much better, much quicker. And underpinning all of that is the ability to build good relationships. So I'm really lucky and excited about my passion now being able to really realize that in an organization and business context.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claire. I love it when we do these kinds of things, because there's always something new that we all learn about each other, never mind for everyone else listening. So next up, David, perhaps we can come to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm really just going to follow on from your initial comments about bringing together diverse people for the greater good. My background is that I graduated in dentistry and then in medicine, looking at or specializing in disease affecting the oral cavity, which is a bit of an orphan bit of your body, despite being one of the most prominent reasons why people attend doctors with non-dental but oral problems. And also, because of my career, I spent some time working in America in NIH, doing research. And so I had an opportunity to bring together medicine and dentistry, but also had an opportunity to have a foot on both sides of the pool and bring that together as well. And just as an interesting, I think, anecdote, I thought I might share with you the the experience of the start of the HIV epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, which started in the early 80s, that it has some parallels to COVID, which is supposed to be a novel disease. But of course, HIV was something which was incredibly novel and had never been seen before. And it started in San Francisco in 81, when somebody noticed that a condition called Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a malignant vascular tumor, had been previously reported, I think, about 20 times over the previous 50 years in elderly African males. And all of a sudden, doctors in San Francisco noticed that 8 men came in with Kaposi's sarcoma within the space of a 2-week period, which was just like winning the lottery 10 times over. And the other thing that was peculiar about those men is that they were all gay. And it took about 2 or 3 years before it was identified that it was actually a viral infection, and that it was spread through direct bodily contact. And so it affected both homosexual people, all to a greater extent because of the promiscuity of some of them, and it also affected drug abusers. Now, as modern travel would have it, a lot of these people, being very artistic, went to the Edinburgh Festival on an annual basis, and they actually brought HIV to Edinburgh. Initially through homosexual contact, but it then got into the drug abusing cohort within the Scottish capital. And that unfortunately coincided with a crackdown by the Scottish police on drug taking. And you would have the police going into drug houses, a council house with maybe 25 drug users. And of course, they never found the drugs. They were just swallowed in little polythene bags, but they took all the needles away and syringes, so that the needles and syringes became the thing that was sought after. And you would have 25 people using one needle every day for 3 months, and using butter and margarine to try and lubricate it to get it through their skin because it became so blunt. And so it meant that if one person in the house became infected, then very quickly 25 people became infected. And my role was that the prominent, at the early stages of the AIDS epidemic, the major presenting features were in the mouth. And I had an opportunity, because I had stateside connections, of knowing about this as it had emerged in America before it came to the UK. And so I had an opportunity to spearhead the response and research in the UK into the oral manifestations of AIDS, and also be directly involved with the prejudice that was associated with finding out that people might infect you. Of course, you had to either share a needle or a bed with them in order to catch it, but that was exaggerated by, I don't know whether you remember the TV advertising of "Don't die of ignorance," and the implication was that everybody was going to die of it, and prominent people were dying. Freddie Mercury never survived the epidemic, for example, and so it was very, very high profile. But the fear among healthcare professionals was extreme. Doctors were not treating people who may be HIV positive. Of course, they didn't have HIV positive tattooed on their forehead. They looked like everybody else. And so, it was bizarre that people were saying, well, I can't treat you because you're HIV positive. And because of my insider knowledge of the patient cohort in Edinburgh, I knew that they were already teaching people, but they didn't know they were HIV positive. So that was the thing that started people like dentists wearing rubber gloves. I mean, in the first 10 years of my professional life, I just, didn't wear gloves and you wipe your blood off on the towel before the next patient came on. And nobody thought anything about that. And when the concept of having to wear gloves to work on somebody's mouth, all the students would say, I can't possibly do that with a pair of rubber gloves on. And I can remember sitting in a lecture theatre talking to students and saying, right, I want you all to turn to the person on your left and stick your finger in their mouth. And they would all go, I can't possibly do that. And I say, well, that's what you're going to do when you go back into the clinic. So you've got to start wearing gloves. And of course, from that, it's escalated till now. If you want to go along to see a dentist at the moment, he's going to look like a spaceman. With all the PPE, so there are parallels. It's an interesting story, but it was exciting to be able to see a patient and say, this is the first patient in the UK who's ever had this particular oral manifestation or condition, and then be able to report that in the literature. And of course, now nobody gives HIV a second thought, although it did probably have a positive effect on cross-infection behavior in the drug abusing and gay community. So that's just a little anecdote of how, coming together from different specialties or different places can have a positive effect, and hopefully it will in DataClan as well.
Thanks, David. Entertaining as always. Next up, following our alphabetic plan, is Rob. So, Rob, what is it you do again?
Well, you said to keep this light-hearted, and I'll try to keep to 5 minutes. My original degree in film was kind of English lit in politics, and I did that at Glasgow. And I'd lived in Cuba just before that, and I'd come back kind of somewhere between an angry young man and liking to play snooker and be a student. And I found politics much more interesting than I had English literature. I mean, I do enjoy it, but I was chronically underread it. But I thought politics, and it was international politics, was very exciting. And I was particularly interested in conflict, and also, as you guys have described there, what drives kind of human behaviour. And I'd always, when I had been at school, you couldn't do things like psychology A levels, and I'd always kind of really wanted to understand a bit more about that. So when I moved to London to work in social housing, which I did in a kind of operational and then research capacity, I ended up doing an undergrad and then a research master's, and then subsequently a PhD with psychology or behaviour, and well, more specifically, it's behavioural psychology over I think however many years it took me to complete all of those things. And I guess just like some of the other guys in the team, it's what we seem to, I think, all be drawn to is answering kind of quite difficult questions, and I know that we don't always find the answer. But one of those questions came, and actually when I was on holiday with Dad, it was at the time of the 7/7 bombings in London, and obviously we'd already had the 9/11 things, and we got into a kind of daily kind of discussion, by the pool or whatever, about looking at the newspapers, the British newspapers that were saying this is what's happened in London and so on. And we got to discussing, well, what are the root causes? What is it that drives somebody to, strap on dynamite and blow themselves up? And I think in the course of that week, and so Dad, I've got you to thank for it, but I think elected to decide to use that as that question as the basis for my research. And like a lot of these things, and you will all be familiar with this, is that once you turn over the stones and start asking the questions and trying to refine your brief, you end up just with a whole lot more questions. And so when I was doing, looking into the literature, there was a vast amount, particularly after 9/11. I mean, the graph of publications on that, as you would expect, went steeply up after the Twin Towers came down. And a lot of it was around what drives a terrorist, or what suicide bombers, and there was lone wolf terrorism, and people were trying to define it and ultimately trying to profile it with a view that to be able to understand what drove it and therefore interrupt that process to reduce the likelihood of it happening. And it was a topical thing. And as Abelson in his psychology book on research talks about the term interestingness, which I'd never heard before I read that chapter, but that chapter talks, whether or not you find something out. I mean, the MMR study on autism, for instance, and the effect of the vaccine on autism, was only covered about 3,000 children, and it ended up being disproved and inconclusive. But nonetheless, because it was topical and interesting, it made the press and so on. And a bit like that, the kind of idea of the threat of terrorism was something that had captured the imagination and of the general public and also the academic community. So after a lot of refining, I began to sort of look at what that literature was saying, and a lot of it was subjective assumptions. So people were using their experience, and we see this a lot through our work in DataClan, is that experience counts for a huge amount and data counts for a huge amount, but not often the two things will corroborate one another. So therefore, there was assumptions about terrorists being narcissistic and having psychopathological traits that were different from normal human beings, and so on and so forth. And there was brainwashing and coercive persuasion and all these things. But there was a sort of subset of emerging information that really attracted my attention by a guy called Andrew Silk, who works at the University of East London. He's regarded as sort of leading terrorism expert, and he was making the call, as you would imagine, with DataClan as a kind of, he had no idea that would come into being. I'm sure he's very relieved, but he decided he was bringing the academic call for empirical research that was going to underpin the subjective assessment. So I was interested in that, but equally terrified it was going to involve lots of numbers and lots of mathematics. And as Chris pointed out, if I'd known him back then I would have phoned him up and asked him to help me. As it happens, what we're looking to do is what we ended up doing is looking at regression analysis and the application of that in understanding how cohesion and other factors increase or decrease your propensity to commit political violence. And the idea was to test these assumptions about what drove people to be politically violent or carry out these acts, and understand whether the extent to which there was a sort of strategic logic behind it, or whether it was driven by your individual some trait psychology. And in broad terms, we looked at kind of cohesion, conformity to authority, and also condition of membership. The kind of idea that, if you have one football hooligan on his own, or her own, I guess, then they're probably quite a nice person. But if you have 100 of them together, then it's a different thing. The same with kind of gang violence and so. It really was about the kind of the impact of the environment, a bit like the Zimbardo experiments and Stanley Milgram experiments and so on, the prison experiment that Zimbardo ran in Stanford, looking at the effect of the environment on the people. So the kind of concept that it wasn't a bad apple, but it was kind of it was barrels that made people kind of act in one way or another. The conclusion of that really was that there was, at least in our simulations, some statistically robust evidence that would suggest that the more cohesive you were as a group, the more likely you were to have a low integrative complexity, which is a measure of decision making, and therefore the kind of conformity element allowed you to come to collective decisions. So you got what people to refer to as group think quite a lot. And those things are, as you know, transferable. Chris talked about it. Dad talked about that in terms of how people make assumptions about what the causes and underlying things are, and Claire as well in the sort of work that she had been doing. And I just think that that continues, with working with you guys, that continues to be something that I find fascinating, and something that I think that, again, going back to what I said at the beginning, it's a problem to be solved, the difficult one. We come across quite a lot of, these are things, but I think that by taking the different perspectives and lenses and looking how we can corroborate evidence from one side or the other, helps to understand the extent to which experience plays a part, the extent to which data plays a part, and the extent to which the two things can be combined to be a bit greater than the sum of their parts.
Fantastic, thank you, Rob. And I remember when you reminded me sometime over the last couple of years about that prison experiment with the members of the public being given roles of inmates or wardens, and the consequent change in their behaviour. As I understand it, implicitly largely from just being given the roles, not through anything else particularly. Okay, so last but by no means least, William, can you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Well, happy to. I was trained as an architect, conventional architectural training, and architects think they're very special, which I suppose they are, and they think they're the only creative people. And I was very interested to hear Chris talking about the creativity of mathematics, and I've never believed this proposition that architects are the only creative people, but I was glad to hear Chris thinks he's creative. I'm sure he is. So I went through his architectural training, and then I sort of more or less straight away went into PhD, which was sort of saying at that time, and still people in architecture say, oh, flexibility is a good thing, make things flexible, that'll pay off. And you think, well, that's a good idea, good principle. What does it actually mean? How do you do it? And so I was trying to sort of get to the bottom of this. And the project ended up being quite mathematical, much more mathematical than most architects are comfortable with. And so it didn't look very architectural, but actually quite relevant. Anyway, I felt that was a successful project. I felt anyway, but after doing that, I went right back to the basics and went to an architectural practice. Worked on a drawing board for 4 years, designing principal sort of project architect for a little block of flats in Wembley, Harrow, 30 flats. Which you can spend 3 or 4 years just working on one little block of flats. There's a lot of decisions to be made. And then after that stint, I went to Hong Kong, got a job as university lecturer at University of Hong Kong. Complete change. And having spent 3 years working on a block of flats for 30 people, for 30 block of flats, 30 flats, the first student project I was assigned to, a teaching group in the university, the first student project I was assigned to was designing a housing estate for 10,000 people. And the difference between the UK and Hong Kong was just stupefying, but that was good, fantastic contrast and change. So 4 years in Hong Kong, then I came back to Britain, Cambridge, and there was a group I joined who were all associated with the research department of the Department of Architecture in the university, and they wanted to sort of peel off from university and do real world work, and this appealed to me much more than trying to pursue an academic career, a bit like Claire, I guess. So I didn't pursue an academic career. I went into this consultancy group, which was a good group. In some ways, similar in a way that DataClan is different group, different people, but working very close, very well together. But different points of view, different perspectives, working collaboration. Anyway, great variety of projects. And one of the more amazing projects I got involved in was being sent to North Korea as an expert on computer-aided design. I don't know how many people they asked to take this job before I accepted, but I wouldn't have thought I was their first choice. But anyway, I was offered it and I took it. And again, it tells you a bit like Hong Kong, but even more so that there are different, the world is different in different places. And one sort of extraordinary, but also slightly macabre contrast was they showed me one of their new blocks of flats, really badly built concrete block of flats, multi-story. And you go up, and on each floor, there are 4 or 5 flats. So you see the flat entrance doors, there's a lift, lift doors, and a staircase. Completely open to the landing. And you say to the people, showing you around, in England, in Britain, we always put a smoke screen between the landing and the staircase, so that if there's a fire, the people from the floor above can get out. The whole staircase isn't blocked by a fire on one level. And they said, we don't have fires in Korea. Willful blindness. So I wouldn't want to be in a block of flats in North Korea. Anyway, I suppose the thing that the areas that that strike me are that I am an architect, so I still do some small amount of architectural practice. So I know quite a lot about buildings, but I do realise that buildings are only a small part of a bigger system. And if you really want to understand on a bigger scale how buildings contribute, you have to look, you can't just be on the drawing board, you have to look at a wider perspective. And I would hope that in this sort of DataClan group, I can contribute knowledge about buildings, but understanding that buildings are part of bigger systems and not an end in themselves. An aspect which interests me a lot is, which goes back to my PhD on flexibility, is how you deal with uncertainty. And I think it's partly because I'm probably the most risk-averse person in the world. So to me, how you deal with uncertainty, is a really big issue. And that's what a lot of people don't really care. They just deal with it. It's not an issue. But to me, how the hell do you do it? And we have reasonable information, and there can't be enough information. So how do you make decisions? And so dealing with uncertainty is I find a very absorbing question. And a technique which I worked on with Chris and others is using simulation models. There are many possible outcomes. We don't know which one's going to happen. If we do simulate many scenarios, we get an idea of the range of things that might happen, and that will help us make should help us make better decisions, which is a far better approach than trying to predict what's going to happen and acting on the basis of that prediction, because a prediction is going to be wrong. So I hope these ideas can come to a fruitful contribution to DataClan's work over the coming years.
Thank you very much, William. It's I'm mindful, as I know you all know, my role with the Building Safety Bill, working with Rob as well as a government advisor. Your observation there about the willful blindness in North Korea with respect to fires is obviously very salient in the current work going on. Well, I'm really grateful for the four of you to share that background, and hopefully for people listening, you feel like you know our team a little better now. We're still young here at DataClan as a team, if in perhaps a few other ways. But I think I probably do speak for all of us in saying that so far it's been a thoroughly enjoyable journey, and it is only the beginning of what we can do. We are starting, and we've got a few very interesting engagements underway now, combining culture, data, behaviors, all of these things you've been thinking about, looking at the impact of the built environment on people and vice versa. And do watch this space. Doubtless there'll be more announcements as those things become more public. I think for now, just to wrap up, I'll get my calculator out. I'm sure Claire will ask me why. David's probably going to stick his finger in my mouth. Bob's going to tell me not to worry, it's not an act of terrorism. And then William will try and help me figure out how to adapt my space to make it easier for David to get his finger in my mouth.
Excellent summary.
But all of that said, together, we are DataClan. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.